But if you want to have an NP, a big stone that's being modified attributively, it becomes falco because they form a much smaller NP phrase versus this entire clause. And metathesis is also triggered anytime you have an enclitic. So where is the determiner? So falt where becomes the stone. So if you see some things changing around, that's probably what's happening. Also, just so you see what the N is, I'm going to give all verbs as with an N, which is the third singular agreement prefix. And this has two forms, N and also na. Okay, well, what I'm actually focusing on today are these two suffixes, one which is a productive causative in B, so this is shown in 4, and a non-productive causative in glottal stop, as shown in 5. So here I've given examples of both intransitives becoming causativized as well as transitives becoming causativized. And we can see that no matter what the argument structure of the base verb is, what happens is that the subject of the base turns into a causee. So to be tired, to tire someone out, hopefully this talk isn't doing that, and to fall versus to make something fall, aka to drop something. You might also notice that the prefix actually changes from to na, and this is a reflex of there having previously been a causative pa prefix there from Proto-Malay-Polynesian that has now disappeared. And that's what this thing is. If you're interested in that, my whole dissertation is on this N to na change. Alright, so the reason I call B productive is that we find it being added to both nouns and nouns. So kana is name, nakana to name someone, jadi comes from Malay jadi, and fry comes from Dutch fry, meaning free, right? And the glottal stop cannot be added. It's a very limited set of verbs that find glottal stop. And there's also a small set of verbs that have both suffixes, right? Where the glottal stop one kind of has a little bit more abstract or idiosyncratic meaning. So natefa means to meet someone, natefa means to make two people meet, literally, and natefa means to reconcile. And it's used in this kind of phrase, natefa neka, meaning to reconcile hearts and minds, essentially. So because of this limited distribution and the slightly more idiosyncratic meanings, I think it's pretty safe to say that the glottal stop is more conservative of the two. So we want to figure out where it's from. I'll go through this quickly just because I'm running out. I want to spend more time on the analysis. But other evidence that the glottal stop is conservative is that all of the Rote languages attest something that's either glottal stop or a KN dysfunction. I've tried to color in the languages based on where the map is, but it's almost everything. And none of them have a B, right? So everywhere, where in Amarasi or in Meto, they use a B causative. So she cries, she makes me cry. The Rote languages will use a glottal stop causative instead, everywhere. So there's no B in Rote. So we can kind of use this to reconstruct a Proto-Rote Meto transitivizing K. I don't think that's too controversial. But what we want to figure out is where the B is from, right? It clearly seems to be a Meto internal innovation because every single Meto language that we have data for has it, right? So the only ones we don't have are Amabi and Keaton, and this is because we don't have the data, not because there's no B yet, right? So it's black swan situation, we can't convert. But these two are basically varieties of Amarasi, so we imagine it probably does have the B, and these ones are kind of more on the edge, as you can see, near the border with East Timor, so it's hard to get as much data on those. Okay. There's also no clear etymological source for B, so B, a weird phoneme in Meto, by which I mean it's really a minority outcome of Proto-Malay-Polynesian. So PMPB, right, according to Owen Edwards' reconstruction, would have produced an implosive B in Proto-Rote Meto, and the reason he reconstructs implosive B is because in Rote languages like Dela, it comes off as a B, right, an implosive, and this is what gives you Meto B. But the regular reflex of PMPB is just F. So Babi becomes Fafi, Batu becomes Fasu, we already saw this. And if you know anything about PMP, there aren't really any B suffixes that could produce this minority outcome. So it's kind of, we want a more recent source. So what is the source? This is what I'm going to argue. It arose diachronically from a step of changes. Firstly, where an epenthetic consonant was inserted at vowel hiatus vowel. So this is going to be a W, semi-glide insertion. It underwent glide fortition and develarization. It became a gwa, and then that became a b, and then this epenthetic consonant was reanalyzed and resegmented as a morphological suffix rather than being phonological. So this is the the phonology to morphology transition. And the triggering factor for this was the high frequency of a third singular object pronoun a, right? So how do we justify consonant insertion or glide insertion? Well, nice thing is that all Meto languages have a hiatus repair strategy of consonant insertion. So the exact identity of the consonant inserted depends on what the dialect is, and is also conditioned by what exactly the two vowels are. So here's a two-way system. This is what we find in Amarasi, where if you have a front vowel, I or E or E, you insert a J. So I, fire, S, one from Esa, becomes I, Jess, a fire, one fire. Same for Mbukai, N is perfected, Mbukai, Jen has Usen. And if you have a back vowel, U or O, you get word insertion instead. So how, where's, and now, when. It doesn't matter whether it's a verb or a noun, doesn't matter what the enclitic is, it just matters what the last vowel of the base is that conditions the consonant insertion. So this is a two-way system, pretty nice. We also find three-way systems in Morphophonological. So again, after E, you get J, but what's different here is after N, you get L instead. And this probably goes back to R, like an intrusive R, like kind of what non-rhotic accents have. That's probably the source of this. Kirsten Colleen has a thesis on that, so if you're interested. And interestingly here, instead of where, they have be. So how, best, and now be, meaning have gone instead. So already we're like, oh, it's a B, then maybe that's useful for us. Also cool that there are four-way systems. No one solved those yet. So the origin of the system diachronically shouldn't be that surprising, goes back to very simple semi-glide insertion. So Amanuban, one of the varieties, actually has y insertion after front vowels, w insertion after back vowels. So this is homoorganic, it's pretty nice. I, yes, my, yen, where we find metathesis, thou, west, and now, when. And so the interesting thing is that metathesis actually diachronically probably originated from some sort of consonant insertion like this. So you can almost think of it as thou, and then another u, have, and then that's basically what the metathesis goes back to. Okay, so with these three varieties that I presented, we have a clear developmental pathway for non-etymological B. It starts as a semi-vowel in w, becomes fortified in w, and then develarized to b. And although you might think each step of these sound changes are kind of controversial, we actually have very clear phonological and typological parallels from Austronesian and beyond. So I don't think it's that difficult to motivate intercalate glide insertion. We know it's because of natural form and transitions. Juliet Blevins work on the perception of homoorganic glides, w and y insertion, that's pretty standard. But glide fetition involving the increase in palatal and velar constriction has actually been well tested in Austronesia itself. And so Bob Bluss has this article where he talks about tomorrow, right? Where the referential focus suffix e normally just surfaces as e after consonant final stem, so amos becomes hamoti, but it surfaces as we after the owl diphthong, so hanao becomes hanagui, and v after sa v. So this is a nice case of what we think of as previously W insertion becoming fortified to Guo insertion. Okay. The second step of develarization to B is attested in a bunch of dialects such as Miomafo, Baikenu, Fataleo, and Modo. So this is just another example of a B dialect. And we have an interesting intermediate stage where the Bavarian dialect of Amarasi has a B. So it's really like from going from Guo to B, they even have an intermediate Guo step. So the dialects are really almost telling us all of the stages involved in getting us to this point. So how, where, the tree, how, where, the line, the slave. So the parallel for this kind of develarization actually comes from Indo-European. So the Proto-Indo-European labial velar stop series in Gua, we know that in a bunch of Kentum languages actually became B. So the past example was gus, meaning cow, ancient Greek bus, Latin bos, in birth and stuff like that, but also in Guemio and in bios, being bios, like biology. So that's a nice parallel of this develarization. Okay, so that's the phonology side. We can get a B from A. But then how does this B then become a suffix? What's going on there? So I propose that there was basically morphological reanalysis and resegmentation, where the epenthetic consonant inserted at the vowel hiatus boundary simply became analyzed as a suffix instead of a phonological epenthetic vowel. And this was triggered by the fact that the most common causee, right? The most common thing that you find after a cause-derived verb would have probably been the third singular object pronoun it, just because, you know, you're often causing him or her or it to do something, right? I think frequency-wise, this is pretty not too hard to swallow, basically. And because it's an enclitic, it would have regularly triggered consonant insertion. So this was facilitated by several factors, mostly involving string ambiguity, where basically The real marker of causativity change, right, was, as I mentioned earlier, the PMP prefix pa, that due to regular sound change would have become phonologically null. Basically, it goes from pa to ha, and then there was anti-penultimate syncope to h, and then HC clusters would reduce. And this is actually what causes the agreement change from in to na. I'm happy to talk about this more in detail, but the whole idea is that really the actual overt marker of causativity was lost due to regular phonology. And so the idea is that speakers would probably have preferred an overt marker of causativity, and what surfaces in these constructions? Oh, it's the epenthetic consonant. That's the difference that we see. So this would have been facilitated by the fact that synchronically speaking, this b is actually ambisyllabic. So it's both the coda of the clitic and the onset of the, the coda of the clitic host and the onset of the clitic itself. So how big, right? Like Jennifer, it's difficult to tell if it's the onset of the coda. So this means that the string in the input, the proto-metal string, would have been more syntactically and phonologically ambiguous, right? Because the bear, unclear if it's on the right or on the left. The covert marker of causativity is really a 0. So what I'm proposing is that this 0 prefix was reanalyzed as this overt suffix in B. And that's really the source of this causative suffix. Now, here we find a nice parallel for Melanesian pidgin. I know that these are really 3 or 4 different varieties, but all of them attest a transdevising suffix in im or m. So in transitive, the car will start in 14a. Transitive, I can't start m, the car. And where does this m come from? It comes from the third singular object pronoun him. Exactly like what I'm proposing in Meto, we get m reduced into the clitic, got him, or something like that, and that just becomes a suffix. So the only difference in Meto and Melanesian pidgin is that the epenthetic consonant associated with this pronoun was reanalyzed rather than the entire pronoun itself. And again, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about why it wasn't the entire B that was reanalyzed as a suffix, but it's probably because B insertion was also found in other causative or transitive contexts as well. So that's an external parallel. There's also a nice meta-internal parallel where we know that this resegmentation happened because a bunch of meta languages innovated these kind of special nominal suffix. This is a special suffix that occurs if the noun is the last thing in its phrase, right? So if you have it in citation, meat is sisij, cow is bijai, dog is asub, right? And if you have it in a compound or modified, suddenly these final consonants disappear. And we have a minimal where if you say one day, it's an NP and a NUMP. So you get NP final B, menob, meset, meaning one day, I did it in one day. But if you have a compound like first day, right, it's menomeset, we don't get the final B because this is really more like attributive modification, essentially. So that's what this B suffix is doing. And as you can tell from this allomorphy, it's pretty clear that this goes back to the consonant insertion. It's a j after I, a l after l, and a b after u. So we know that meta languages did turn these consonants into suffixes in the environment of nouns, so why wouldn't they also do it in verbs? So the dialect puzzle, you might have already thought of these 2 issues, which I will now talk about. Why did B spread from the dialects that develarized it to all the other dialects that retained were? And why was B reanalyzed and not something like l or j instead, like in the nominal? So the first one, my solution is basically contact and spread. So the develar dialects, aka the ones that have b, are really the ones right in the middle, right? So bicano, neomorpho, molo, fatuleo. It's like this like L shape over here. So geographically speaking, it's well placed for some sort of wave-like diffusion going outwards to the rest of the dialects. But then you could say like, okay, but how do we know these people were actually in contact? We have very clear social historical cues, right? If we look at the histories, Fatuleo, Neomorpho, and Molo being start because that's actually the capital, were the core of the Sonbai Empire, which was the most prestigious polity in West Timor. And it's quite interesting because the Dutch and the Portuguese who came there, they called the emperor of Sonbai Kaiser or Imperador, right? They had a special title for him. And all of the other kings, Amanatun, Angkor, Baikeno, Amrasi, they had a different term, Ampu, which were minor kings instead. So we know there was a bit of an asymmetrical relation. And we also know that the Sonbai emperor was calling meetings where he summoned the other people to meet with him in like a big council, essentially. So there's some sort of We know that there's geographical proximity. We know that these people were in contact because they were in meetings together. And we know that that's possible social cultural prestige because the Songhai Empire was recognized on a different level. This is just talking about why it's highly unlikely that each dialect innovated it independently. I think it's quite obvious because they don't have bees. And this is the more interesting question that I love to have, some discussion about. Why only B and why not J or L? Now, I don't have a firm answer for this, and I think we need to do more dialectal work to figure it out, but here are some possibilities, right? It could be that J and L did turn into transliterizers. There are also suffixes in T and N, but I don't think the phonology supports changes like that. It could be frequency or things like B is the most marked. It's like the most non-minimal consonant insertion, so it's the most salient kind of weird thing to insert, maybe versus a Korean or African. It could be frequency and distribution. B is inserted after 2 vowels, J and L after only 1. These are all possible solutions that I need to think about more. But just to quickly conclude, the first bullet point is a summary of what I'm proposing. We get phonetic to phonologization of the inserted consonant, and then that gets morphologized. And this is really a case of what Roger Last calls acceptation, where material, right, that was inserted that kind of becomes junk or no longer clear or no longer transparent gets co-opted for serving a new function, typically because of some sort of string ambiguity. And the kind of last slide I had, answering the question of how exactly this happened is different from answering why. Why just B? Why this moment in time? Why not L or J? And this is just a bigger theoretical point about the importance of supplementing historical linguistics with field-based documentation and theoretical analysis as well. Thank you very much.